Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our meeting today. We wanted to talk about commercial leases from really more of an introductory standpoint. So if you have questions, we'd like to be able to answer them if we can. This is a little bit of an unusual format, but just unmute yourself and feel free to ask questions. So before you begin negotiating a commercial lease, my best advice is to really understand your client's business, because a lot of times clients call and they tell you they need or want a certain type of space, but that really doesn't meet their needs. So understand your client's business, understand not just their current needs, but what their future needs will be and how they expect that to affect them over the next few years. It's usually not a good idea to lease a lot more space than you need, but if you're expecting rapid growth, then it can affect your ability to determine the size. How much business risk do they face? If it's a riskier business, then it's going to be more important to negotiate terms like to give up some things in order to get the opportunity to terminate early or reduce their personal guarantee. Also understand other contractual obligations they have. For example, they might be a franchisee who has a duty to put a lease rider or some other information into a lease for the benefit of their franchisor. So these are always good questions to ask and learn about your client in the process before you waste a lot of time showing them space that's not going to work for them. The commercial lease process usually starts with an LOI. And I'll be honest with you, quite frankly, I tell my clients, trust your commercial broker to negotiate the bulk of that LOI. You don't need to include a lawyer at this stage. Let your broker work with the landlord to get a good LOI negotiated. It helps you understand how flexible the landlord's going to be. It also allows the commercial broker to build a relationship with their client and show them how good they are. I also advise that you be strategic about what you negotiate. Once you see how negotiable the landlord is, sometimes you might decide, if it's a difficult landlord, that you want to push some of those terms off to a later date and see if the attorney can renegotiate it on the back end. But those are just strategic choices to make along the way. Things that I like to see in an LOI that I think really help define the nature of the transaction is to include the length of the term plus any options. For me personally, I think a shorter term with more options is generally more advantageous to a tenant. And that way, if things don't go well and they decide in year 3 of a 5-year lease, they might need to close this business or in that case, or if it's really a good business and they need to move to a larger space, it's easier to negotiate on those last 2 years of rent than to be in the middle 3 years into a 10-year lease. On the flip side, if the space works out and they don't need to move, already having the leverage on the landlord that they get to renew for 2 or 3 or 4, 5-year renewal chunks sure makes it easy. It's also easier for you to track. Generally, the commercial broker gets paid on those renewals, and so you can go ahead and put the due dates for those in your calendar. Whenever notice is required, you can pre-calendar those reminders so that you can reach out to the client. It builds rapport with your client, but it also protects your future revenue. I like to see base rent negotiated to the extent possible, and that for most tenants, that's the big thing. They need to know how much rent they're going to have to pay. That usually includes an estimate of their CAM charges, whatever their triple net costs are going to be. If they can understand that, then they can decide if this is a good business decision. And I think they rely heavily on the brokers to understand, what is the market? Obviously, what office space was renting for last year is not quite the same as what office space is renting for today. We all know that there are ebbs and flows, and when landlords can, they're very aggressive in the marketplace for trying to push their rents up. But when they don't have that leverage, make sure you let them know and you back off of that, and you start from a much lower negotiating place. I like to see a cap on operating expenses if possible. If not, I negotiate it when I get the lease. Generally, I'm trying to get a 3 to 5% cap on the controllable costs year over year. And I find that landlords are pretty much giving in the 3 to 5, well, 5 to 7% range. So, we haven't really seen how the effects of COVID are going to affect negotiability, but I have started to see landlords becoming much more reasonable, and I think that they will continue to do so, and they'll be willing to negotiate these caps. Understanding your client's intended use so that you get the right language on the permitted use is really important. And so if your client says, all I do is I cut hair, I just cut hair, that's all I need. I need the ability to cut hair. But if you think about that, you also need an office associated with that hair cutting. Is it for men, women, and children? Is it for men only? Do they also do manicures? Do they also have a little boutique where they sell combs and shampoos and clippers and whatever else? So please try to structure those intended use for as broad as you can, because what happens later is the landlord may lease to a beauty supply who puts a restriction in there that there can be no other beauty supply sales. But now we have this boutique. And if we have it first and we have it in our permitted use, then we can fight back against them trying to restrict our use of that boutique. But if it's not in our permitted use, they might try to make us take it out. So I try to make my permitted use as broad as I can, even if I later say, I'll take an exclusivity only on haircuts. You won't let anyone else do haircuts here. But that's my exclusivity. That's not my permitted use. And that permitted use, I want it really broad. Then maintenance is always an issue. So sometimes you get a vanilla shell that's really just concrete, sheetrock walls, and it's a wide open space, and your client's going to completely build it out. But that's not always the case. A lot of times you go into an existing space that's already got some of the improvements there and an existing air conditioner and existing wiring. And so when I get an existing space, one, I try to get the landlord to agree that they'll take care of the maintenance for the first 90 days, even up to 6 months. Because essentially what I'm saying is, if you know there's a problem, I want to know now. I don't want to lease this space and then realize I have to buy a $25,000 HVAC system. So a lot of times if they'll agree to maintain it for a little bit of time, that gets your client in there and an opportunity to understand what's going on. If I can't get them to agree to maintain it, then my backup is that I want them to get a HVAC tech, electrician, and a plumber to come out and inspect it and give us a report that it's in working condition. Again, we just don't want to lease this space and find out there's concrete in the sewer lines and we now have to dig up a slab to fix all that. The next thing I like to see in the LOI is the tenant improvement allowance. Many landlords will offer your clients some improvement money to improve the space to meet their needs. In fairness, they do amortize that across the life of the lease, and so you'll pay more for your lease depending on how much money you get, but it's not usually a dollar for dollar. So if you're a good negotiator, you can often get more TI money than is actually increased in the rent, especially if you have a tenant that really meets their needs. And one of the things I do to try to exploit getting more TI money is I try to, especially when I have a tenant who fits a niche. For example, if they have restaurants in their center that, of course, bring lunch and evening traffic, I try to argue, well, my bagel tenant is going to bring morning traffic. So they're going to be here. Their peak hours are going to be the opposite of the existing tenants. So they'll create less burden on the other parts of the infrastructure like parking and traffic in the area. And so this is a better tenant for you. Certainly if I have a clean tenant, for example, I have a tenant who is in the restaurant space, but maybe they're a smoothie bar or a fruit and juice bar. So they're not going to have a grease trap. They're going to be clean. It's a cleaner concept. I try to exploit that to try to get the landlord to give them more TI money. And certainly any tenant who can just fill in a little gap. So oftentimes you'll have a little orphan space that has been leased around and it just left one 1,100 square foot space. So I try to get a little leverage there. How many people just need this little 1,100 square foot space? Well, my cookie client is going to be perfect for that. And so I try to use those opportunities to negotiate where I can, where it seems like I have a small, insignificant client with no leverage. I try to reverse that and find ways to make them the best possible tenant for this space. To the extent it's possible to discuss subletting and assignments ahead of time, I like to see them in the LOI. If not, I negotiate them when I get them and I get the lease. Part of that is because some tenants have an inherent need to sublease. So a lot of times that happens in beauty salons where you have a salon owner who has stylists, but they lease space to someone who does eyebrows and waxing or someone who's does other functions. And so they may sublease that space on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. Another place I see this a lot is with my medical clients. So for example, I represent a large cardiology group, and they often have a dietitian who will come in once a week, and that person leases space from them, but provides services to their clients. I see this with orthopedists, where they have a big office that they lease to someone who brings in all the braces and other support services, crutches, and all of those things that their clients need. They sublease that space. And so we need to negotiate that ahead of time if there's an obvious reason that our client's going to need it as part of their business. I also like to have some language either in the LOI or at least in the lease that allows the client to transfer in the event they sell all of their assets. So if someone completely buys the entire business, then they have a right to transfer the lease to them. I find signage to be very important. It's often a source of contention. And so I like to get my approval of my signage before I sign my lease, so that there's no doubt that the landlord is going to approve it. More and more, we're seeing that leases have the duty to subordinate to the lender, but they don't include non-disturbance language. And so I think that's very important. And it protects the client from a mortgage company foreclosing on the property and not recognizing their lease. So it's really important that a tenant have non-disturbance protections there. And then I like to talk about hazardous materials. At delivery, the landlord should provide premises that are free from hazardous materials. And a lot of times now they try to add language that says the tenant is responsible for whatever hazardous materials are found without specifying that it's only if that's the tenant's fault. So the tenant should not accept responsibility for pre-existing conditions. And then finally, I like to see in the LOI is specifically stated out that there is a broker involved and there's a broker commission. It's really important to me that I protect the brokers I work with and I know they're going to get paid. And it takes a little bit of worry off of the tenant because there's almost always language in the lease that says there's no undisclosed brokers and we're not going to pay anything. And so it's just really important to make sure that there's without a doubt, there is going to be a broker commission here, and they can either pay it pursuant to a second agreement, or they can include the language in the lease. So then we get to the lease. And if possible, I like to use a Texas Realtor form. It's fair, it's short, it doesn't take a lot of haggling. Unfortunately, most landlords have their own lease. You should never trust that your negotiated points are from the LOI are included in the lease, because many times they're not. I haven't decided if that is an accident or on purpose, but you should always check your leases to make sure your negotiated deal points that you worked hard for have been included in that lease. So moving through the lease, I just want to remind you that details matter. You want to make sure the legal names are correct. A lot of times the tenants say, "Oh, I'm the bat store," and that's just put the bat store. But surely they have a legal name where it's the Bat Store Incorporated or the Bat Store Limited Liability Company or whatever they are. Try to make sure you understand that, because a lot of people just don't realize how important that is. Make sure the premises are accurately defined. And so sometimes you can do that with a postal address and a suite number. And I'm going to show you some examples here, but making sure that that's defined accurately can save you lots of trouble going forward. So here's an example where we used a postal address and actually inserted the legal description of the property. I'm not so wild about this option myself, because I don't think the average person knows what this says. And so if it's wrong, it's not something you or your client could pick up on. So, but some landlords will include this. Here's a great example of where we have a picture, a depiction of the shopping center. And then right here, it says, these are the premises. And it's easy for the client to look across here. And in this case, there was a Starbucks on the corner, and there was a donut space here. There was an empty space beside him. Oh, yep, you're right. I'm right here, and I know exactly where I am. And there's no dispute later about which space is mine. And in this case, this was a shopping center that was being completely redeveloped. So there was an opportunity for confusion. I also like to put pictures for other reasons. In this particular lease, it was a medical building, and the tenant had negotiated to have 5 consecutive spaces together so that they could put their vaccination clinic RV. And so they wanted a place to park the RV, and we negotiated heavily to get this. But then the landlord essentially wanted to say, yeah, you can park it here. But then that would have put the burden on the tenant to hope they could find the spaces necessary to park their RV. And what we actually wanted were dedicated spaces. And so eventually we just got this picture, agreed to allocate these 5 spaces to the vaccine RV, and they would always have the right to park there. And so we included that exhibit so that there was no doubt that the tenant could hold the landlord accountable for that. Other ways you can help your client and yourself is like I said, when you receive the lease, make sure you check to make sure all of the LOI terms are there and note any differences. And also send a calendar invite to your client for any renewals. If they have to send notice to the landlord 9 months in advance to renew their lease, then a year before their lease expires, you should reach out to them and say, how are things? Do you still want to keep this space? If so, we need to give notice. If not, we need to start shopping right now for another space. That gives you an opportunity to get that renewal turned in. Make sure remind the landlord that you know you're entitled to commissions on renewals and you'll be expecting that. So all of these things help protect your client, but it also helps protect your revenue. Why have an attorney review the lease? Having an attorney review the lease allows you a second bite at the negotiations. Sometimes there's things the landlord wouldn't give you, but you can tell the attorney, we still want to try to get this. We still want to negotiate on this or that. And it allows the opportunity for the attorney to go negotiate. I know in my case, I negotiate a lot of leases. So I'm very familiar with the landlords in the area. And it's not uncommon that I will from time to time use prior negotiations to say, look, you gave me this last week when I negotiated for lifetime, and now you need to give it to me again. It's not I know you do make this concession, so work with me on this. So that just gives you an extra opportunity to negotiate for your client. It gives you more credibility with your client and the landlord. It's good for landlords to know that clients have attorneys, and if they mistreat them, they might call their attorney to get backup support. And a lawyer can be a good resource for your client going forward. They're going to have other legal matters that come up, and when you have provided them with a good referral resource, that looks good on you and builds goodwill for you. The caveat there is that you need a good lawyer who is able to provide the services your client needs without overcharging them. I know in our firm, we expect leases to be negotiated and evaluated for around $2,500. But I hear frequently that people are charging $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 and even more to review leases and negotiate with them with the landlords. So if you refer your client to someone who charges them $12,000 to review the lease, that doesn't build goodwill for you. Possible pitfalls, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. Be careful about pre-existing hazardous materials or hazardous conditions. Those liabilities need to stay with the landlord. Americans with Disabilities Act violations. The spaces have to be accessible to people with disabilities, but parking lots and entrances are a big hot point for litigation, and those should fall on the landlord. And so I like to remind the landlord that their obligation to take care of the common areas and make them ADA compliant is going to be their obligation. They can't push that off onto the tenant because they will try. Again, I like to get my signage approved before I sign the lease. You have the most leverage before you sign the lease. Afterwards, they'll just make you follow their standards. Frequently, landlords like to have the right to put for lease signs up in the space on the last 30, 60, or 90 days. I'm agreeable with that, but I try to put in the lease that they cannot put them on the front door because it makes your client look like they've closed, and a lot of times it affects their traffic. Alterations. Landlords always reserve the right to approve alterations, but I try to get simple things like cosmetic changes. We have the right to paint, wallpaper, change out the flooring without the landlord's approval so that you don't have to go through those additional steps. I also ask my client to send the insurance portion of the lease to their insurance broker. Generally, they are only asking for general liability and workers' comp, but if they want more, if the landlord is seeking more than that, or they're seeking amounts that seem very high, then I ask the landlord, I ask the tenant to have that checked by their broker, just to make sure the coverage is available, that it's actually necessary for their type of business, because if it's not, I push back and try to get that eliminated from the lease. I also try to make sure that the tenant is going to get notice of any and an opportunity to cure any defaults. So a lot of times it says if you default, we'll give you 3 days notice, but it doesn't clarify that you could cure in that 3 days and it not be a default anymore. And that's really important that they have that opportunity to cure. And then finally, the landlord by statute has a lien on the property the personal property that's inside the space, and they also claim it in their lease. But I like to make sure they understand they have to subordinate that lease to a lender, so they can't be the top of the lease of the liens. They have to say, okay, I'll put mine below the primary lender so that the tenant can borrow money in order to buy the FF&E, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. And don't forget, we talked about franchisees. Franchisees often need special provisions. They need to be able to alter their space in compliance with the national standards for their franchise brand. They need to be able to assign the lease back to their franchisor or a qualified franchisee. And signage is always tricky with franchisors because they usually have very distinct, unique signage requirements that are cumbersome. And working with the landlord to get them approved is can be time consuming. And that is our quick introduction into commercial leases. Are there any questions that I could answer for you? First, let me say I appreciate your time on your lunch hour, and I hope this was a great lunch and learn opportunity. But are there any questions that I could answer? Well, y'all are a very easy group and quiet as well. So my time is up, but thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis.